Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I'm going to be sharing with you a new collection of Rec.709 LUTs I created for transforming C-Log and C-Log3 video shot using either a Canon EOS R5 or R6. These LUTs are derived from Canon's official LUTs, and they not only transform C-Log and C-Log3 to the standard Rec.709 color space, but they also account for exposure. They also account for footage that has been underexposed or overexposed intentionally or otherwise. Let me show you an example of what I mean. The three videos you're looking at here were shot using C-Log3's cinema gamut on a Canon EOS R5. The video in the center was properly exposed, but the video on the left was underexposed by 2/3 a stop, and the video on the right was overexposed by 2/3 a stop. Now, if this was an actual project and we imported all three videos into Premiere, Final Cut, DaVinci Resolve, the first step typically would be applying Canon's official C-Log3's cinema gamut to Rec.709 LUT, which if we did, the footage would now look like this. Now you should definitely see the difference. To state the obvious, the footage on the left is too dark and the footage on the right is too bright. And unfortunately, this happens all the time, at least it does for me, where when you're shooting in log, it's kind of hard to see a lot of times if you have proper exposure because everything is flat and gray. And yeah, I mean, you can do the right thing and use a gray card, use waveforms, use false color, use zebras, use all that good stuff. But if you have a project that has a lot of footage in it, a lot of C-Log and C-Log3 footage that needs to be graded and needs to be transformed to Rec.709, any time that is spent just messing around with exposure before any creative color grading and editing can be done is just a total waste of time, especially when it's possible to adjust exposure at the same time that you're transforming footage to Rec.709. So now, instead of using Canon's official C-Log3 cinema gamut to Rec.709 LUT, let's now use the exposure correction LUTs instead. All three videos appear virtually the same. It's really hard to tell the difference actually between the underexposed video and the overexposed video compared to the properly exposed video in the middle. Now, in case you're curious to know, technically speaking, what's going on here behind the scenes, every flavor of log, whether it's made by Canon or some other camera company, they all have a native log curve. And what that curve does is it transforms that flat gray log footage into the Rec.709 color space by assigning a white point and assigning a black point, and then transforming all the highlights and the midtones and the shadows in between with the proper brightness and contrast to appear correct. So these exposure correction LUTs that I created take that native log curve for both C-Log and C-Log3, and they shift it to the left or to the right in order to fix and compensate for under and overexposed footage. The highlights and the midtones and the shadows are transformed mathematically, so it's no longer a subjective thing, using your eyes looking at the video or looking at your waveform monitor, and then adjusting your highlights and your shadows and your midtones or playing around in the tone curve panel, trying to get that footage to appear correct, because these exposure correction LUTs take care of that for you. And that whole process of importing footage, converting everything to Rec.709, and fixing exposure before I could do anything with color grading or editing just felt so incredibly slow and just unnecessary. So I started looking around for solutions, ways of addressing this. And I did find a collection of similar LUTs from someone else that I downloaded and tried, and I thought they worked well. However, their collection was too small to meet my needs because I not only shoot C-Log3 on the R5, but I also shoot in C-Log on the R6 as well. And sometimes shooting in BT709 compared to cinema gamut is a good option. And I wanted 1D LUTs in addition to 3D. It's one of those rabbit holes that I just couldn't avoid. So I ended up taking a DIY approach, digging in, figuring out how to do it, and I ended up making my own. Now let's take a look at what's inside the zip file you may purchase and download. Inside, you will find a user guide PDF that contains similar information to what I talked about in this video. And then there are two folders, one labeled 1D and one labeled 3D. These are separate collections of 1D and 3D LUTs. Now, if you don't know the difference between a 1D LUT and a 3D LUT, a 1D LUT is a more specialized LUT. It's a simpler LUT that only affects brightness and contrast. It does not affect or manipulate color. Whereas a 3D LUT is more sophisticated. Most LUTs out there today are 3D LUTs, and these are probably the ones that you would use most. These affect not only brightness and contrast, but they also interpolate color. They give you a more finished image compared to a 1D LUT. But it's nice to have both, I have found, depending on what type of color grading you're doing. Inside the 1D folder, you will find exposure correction LUTs for C-Log and C-Log3 to Rec.709. And then inside 3D, you will find options for C-Log to Rec.709, and then C-Log3, BT709 to Rec.709, and Cinema Gamut to Rec.709. Now, BT709 and Cinema Gamut are color spaces you can assign when you set up C-Log3 in your EOS R5. BT709 is effectively Rec.709, while Cinema Gamut is a larger color space than Rec.709. It contains more color information, and for that reason, especially amongst colorists and people who like to color grade their footage, Cinema Gamut is a better option to use because it gives you more creative flexibility in post. But if you just want to shoot directly to Rec.709, then you would use the BT709 color space when configuring C-Log3 on the camera. Then inside each directory, you will find all the requisite exposure correction LUTs for each type of log. Now, the way these work from a workflow perspective, and this is actually what I do with my footage all the time, is it's kind of like exposure compensation on a camera, which I'm sure you're familiar with. You have 0 in the center, and then negative to the left, and positive to the right. So what you would first do when you import that C-Log or C-Log3 footage is apply Canon's native official C-Log or C-Log3 to Rec.709 LUT. And for convenience purposes, that LUT is included in this collection, and it has native in its title. So you apply that one first, you take a look at your footage, you take a look at your waveform, and determine whether it needs to be corrected, if the footage has been overexposed or underexposed in camera. If it was overexposed, you apply a negative LUT. If it was underexposed, you apply a positive LUT. And these LUTs are divided up into stops. So there is negative 1/3, negative 2/3, negative full stop, negative 1 1/3, and so on. As long as that footage has been under or overexposed within 2 stops in either direction, you should be able to transform and fix those exposure anomalies and get your footage looking correct. Quick disclaimer, and perhaps to state the obvious, there's nothing these exposure correction LUTs or any other piece of software can do in order to account for clipped pixels. If you've clipped your whites, if you've blown out your whites or your blacks, there's nothing you can do. That detail is effectively lost because we're talking about digital video here. So just wanted to make sure that was clear. And by the way, these LUTs aren't limited to video editing. You may use them in Adobe Photoshop as well. And this is actually really cool. If you've never done this before, it's something that I do quite frequently when making thumbnails for YouTube, when making images for social media, when making images for blog posts or articles. Because what you can do is open some log video, say in QuickTime, copy a keyframe from it, then paste that keyframe into Photoshop. You would then go to the adjustments panel and apply a lookup table adjustments layer. And then in there, you would assign a 3D LUT. And again, just like when editing video, if the native Rec.709 LUT appears too bright or too dark, you have other options to work with. Also, concerning compatibility, these LUTs may be used with C-Log footage shot using an R5 or an R6, and with C-Log3 footage shot using the R5. If you own an R5 and you don't see C-Log3 as an option on the camera, it means you need to update the camera's firmware. Because Canon updated it a few months ago, and now it includes C-Log3, which is awesome. However, at the time of this video, the R6 has not been upgraded to include C-Log3. It only supports C-Log at the current time. So hopefully that'll change. And when and if it does change, then these LUTs should be compatible with C-Log3 on the R6 as well. Also important to note, these exposure correction LUTs should really only be used with C-Log and C-Log3 footage shot using either an R5 or an R6, because C-Log and C-Log3 on those cameras is different than C-Log and C-Log3 on other Canon cinema cameras. So yeah, obviously I'm a little bit biased because I created these LUTs and now I'm selling them, which by the way, you may purchase through a link below in the video description if you would like to hop over and download and start using them today. But for me and my workflow, they have made a big difference. I mean, I use them all the time when I'm color grading C-Log and C-Log3 footage, and they're so much faster and easier. And there's also just having that peace of mind as well of just knowing that you are fixing exposure correctly. It's just so nice being able to import all that footage, fix all those underlying exposure problems, getting everything even and proper and looking good, and then continuing on, then moving on to the good stuff, right? Then moving on to color grading and editing and all that. This just gets all that technical stuff out of the way and just makes things so much faster. By the way, speaking of shooting video on the R5, in case you didn't see my video from last week, I'm currently running a giveaway for a free 512 gigabyte CF Express Type B card. This is a pretty big card, and it's made by NKI. I talked about this card last week because NKI sent me a couple of these to test out, provide feedback on, and to review. I'm keeping one of them, but they sent me another that I can give away to viewers of this channel if you would like to win one. So I will link to this giveaway down below if you would like to hop over to my website, enter your email address to participate. And next month I will select a random winner, and if you win, I'll send you a brand new 512 gigabyte CF Express Type B card. Remember to like and subscribe below, and also click the bell icon if you would like to be notified of future videos when they come out. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. I'll see you next time.